Hello, all. I think you would have reviewed part one for chapter one till now, and let me know if you have questions. I did want to give a short lecture on part two, which would be a continuation of part one. So, in the first part one, what we did see was classification, measuring levels of trade. And in this part, we are going to look at classification of countries by levels of economic development. So first, what are levels of countries' economic development? You may have heard terms like third world, first world. I must say that these terms are pretty outdated, and in some context, it is also not good to use these terms. So I would start refraining use of such phrases like third world countries because they have a negative connotation towards it. So the newer phrase or language, as we discuss about how countries have developed over a few years, include newly developing, developing, and developed countries. Developed countries are comprised of economically advanced nations where citizens enjoy a relatively high level of well-being. Examples would include like the United States, Canada, Australia, Denmark, and so on. So a lot of these countries would be categorized as developed countries. Developing countries, on the other hand, are grouped in the middle that have made some progress out of poverty and striving for better lives. So these are the countries which have generally made some progress towards their economy and are either fast-paced in terms of working towards how they can uplift their society and industry. Examples would include countries like China, India, um, Brazil. So these would be the examples for developing countries. Newly developing countries, on the other hand, are the poorest nations in the world and have very low level of economic development, may have struggles in their political situation as well, but they are trying to find ways to improve their well-being. Now, we will be discussing a lot during the entire course about newly developing, developing, and developed countries. So how do we know which countries, what are those different indicators for us to know which countries are developed, developing, or newly developing countries? So as we think about economic development, we would think about gross national product, gross national product per capita, gross domestic product, and gross domestic product per capita. So these are some of the indicators which are used currently to measure levels of economic development for countries. Now, what do they stand for? And these definitions can be found in the global lexicon in. So, as we discussed before, some economic indicators which are generally used to determine countries' level of economic development. While there are different indicators, like we discussed in the previous slide, GNP and GNP per capita, we generally go ahead with using GDP per capita to determine countries' level of economic development. Um, and we will see on the next slide as to why that case would be, as each one has a different way of measuring the value of products and services which are produced within a. So gross national product or GNP is the value of the average output produced by domestic residents of a nation as they labor within that nation. Now, I want you to focus on the words domestic residents, and it is the value of average output in terms of any products or services that are manufactured or developed within a country. So think about, especially in the US context, think about all the immigrants were also contributing to the economy. Now, in a GNP calculation, immigrants, any output, manufacturing or creating services developed by immigrants or who are non-domestic residents of the country would not be taken into account. Now, this could be this if this measure is taken for economic development indicator, it could be skewed because if a country has a huge percentage of immigrants within their society, it wouldn't be taking into account all the contributions, economic contributions these immigrants are uh, contributing to the country. And per capita would generally mean that whatever value you achieve, you just divide by the population within the country. So GNP per capita would be GNP value of a country divided by the number of people in the population. However, gross domestic product or GDP is the market value of the products and services produced within a country in a year by all people within the country. So this would include all the population, which is domestic residents, as well as immigrants within the country as well. Um, and domestic GDP per capita would include GDP value divided by the number of people in the population after GDP has been adjusted by purchasing power parity. So these would be GDP per capita would be the most accurate measure of knowing where the country stands in terms of newly developing, developing, and developed countries. So how does newly developing countries and GDP per capita relate to each other? Newly developing countries, GDP per capita is significantly lower than world average. GDP per capita is about the same as world average for developing countries, and for developed countries, GDP per capita is significantly higher than world average. Now, you may think, how does all of this relate to sourcing of you may think, how does this all relate to sourcing of textiles or clothing? Now, I want you to put it in perspective that newly developed. Let's start with developing countries. Developed countries generally are the consuming society or consumption centric. Developing countries are mostly the manufacturing hubs because they have a lot of labor and they are trying to boost their economy. They could have higher population, which also helps with the labor intensivity of apparel industry, and hence they are more likely to engage in apparel manufacturing. And newly developing countries, they are just starting off in the apparel industry, so they're going to do anything which is a low skilled job or anything which is repetitive, not anything which is complicated. Developing countries generally have the capabilities and the capacity to handle large orders. And that is how we put in context for the textiles and clothing industry. Now, when I said before, newly developing, they're just starting off in apparel manufacturing, basic jobs. Developing countries are focusing on high quantity, more skilled jobs. They have expertise in different aspects of the supply chain for the apparel manufacturing. However, developing countries may not have the capabilities of textile manufacturing, primarily because either there is fiber shortage or they do not have the technology and intelligence, if you may, intelligence to develop or textiles, which need more scientific background. And hence, developing countries may not be a great choice for textile manufacturing as such. And they're also very capital intensive, further attributing to the point of why developing countries do not engage in textile manufacturing. Developed countries, however, are more into textile manufacturing because they can invest capital into it. They do have the workforce, which may include um, more education. So let's see if we can classify some countries based on their GDP per capita. Luxembourg is about 106,300. Think about it and kind of guess in your mind which country do you think it goes into. It would be one of the developed economies or developed countries. Uh, Vietnam is at $6,900. Take a moment to think where do you think Vietnam would fit into? It is still a newly developing country, but it is moving really fast, especially in the textiles and especially in the apparel production. Um, and with the new revised CPTPP, that's a trade agreement, which we'll cover more in the next in following classes over the semester. Vietnam is poised to become the next biggest apparel manufacturing country. Um, Hong Kong, this would constitute as a developed country as well. China, while China has, okay, let's just see which one it comes into. It does come into developing. Now, I want you to be very careful as you're looking at these numbers. If you looked at China's GDP, it has surpassed a lot of the developed economies. When I say just the GDP, it has surpassed US's GDP 2 times higher. However, GDP per capita for China is very low because of its population, and hence it would still be classified under the developing countries. Dominican Republic, it would also go under developing country. It is one other country which is very close to the United States, has trade agreements with the United States, a robust apparel manufacturing capabilities include are present in Dominican Republic. And lastly, let's look at Kenya. Kenya would be classified as a newly developing country. Um, a lot of medical, political issues in some of the African countries has not contributed for Kenya's apparel and textile manufacturing capabilities. So I guess this is the end of